The air in the royal keep always grew heavy on the night of the blood moon, thick with a silence that was more menacing than any howl. It clung to the cold stone walls and settled deep in the lungs, a mix of old fear and unspoken ritual. For the servants who scurried through the lower passages, it was a night to keep your head down and your prayers silent. The king's beast was restless, and the entire north held its breath. For me, the silence was a constant companion, but tonight it felt like a predator, its breath hot on my neck. Something was about to break. The summons came not as a polite request, but as a judgment. Marin, the head housekeeper whose face had long since soured into a permanent sneer, found me in the lye-scented gloom of the scullery. My hands were raw, submerged in a basin of greasy water, my knuckles chafed red from scrubbing pots meant for feasts I would never taste. Her shadow fell over me first, sharp and unforgiving. "Aveline." Her voice cut through the rhythmic scrape of my brush against iron. I did not look up, not at first. To meet the gaze of a superior was an invitation for scrutiny, and scrutiny was an invitation for pain. I was an Omega, a whisper in the great roar of the Vaelric dynasty, and my purpose was to be unseen, unheard, and useful. "The king requires you," she said, and the words were stones dropped into the still, dark pool of my existence. A collective gasp rippled through the other servants in the scullery. Heads turned, eyes wanned with a venomous mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Whispers erupted like sparks from a dying fire. Her? The quiet one. The gods have mercy on her. I finally lifted my head, my gaze meeting Marin's in the flickering torchlight. Her eyes held a cruel satisfaction. She had always resented me, for a reason I couldn't fathom. Perhaps it was my silence, which she took for insolence. Or perhaps it was something else, something she sensed in me that I kept buried so deep even I could barely feel it. "Now," she commanded, her lip curling, "and make yourself presentable. You will not shame this keep with your filth." I rose slowly, my knees aching from hours of kneeling on the cold flagstones. I dried my hands on my coarse linen apron, my fingers trembling. This was not a summons for mending or cleaning, not on this night, not to his chambers. We all knew the stories. The women, always Omegas, chosen on the nights of the celestial moons to soothe him. They were called companions for the night, a pretty term for a terrifying duty. Some returned in the morning, pale and shaken, their eyes hollowed out by whatever they had witnessed. They never spoke of it, their silence bought with a pouch of silver and the lingering terror in their scent. Others did not return at all. 2 royal guards were waiting outside the scullery, their silver wolf head emblems gleaming on their dark leather armor. Their faces were grim, impassive masks that offered no comfort. They fell into step on either side of me, their presence a cage of muscle and steel. We did not walk the servants' paths. We ascended the main staircase, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls, past portraits of grim-faced Vaelric ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow my shameful procession, past grand tapestries depicting bloody victories and slain dragons. The air grew cleaner, scented with beeswax, polished wood, and the faint, cold fragrance of winter herbs. It was the scent of power, a world away from the sweat and grime of my own. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the profound silence of the royal wing. I clutched my hands together, trying to stop their shaking. I had done as Marin ordered, splashing my face with clean water and smoothing down my simple brown dress. I had unbound my hair, letting it fall down my back in a pale ash-blonde sheet. It was all I had. I was a plain offering for a king who commanded armies and conversed with the ancient spirits of the north. The guard stopped before a set of massive ironwood doors, twice my height and carved with a single snarling wolf. This was the threshold, the point of no return. One of the guards knocked once, a sharp, resonant rap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the keep. A low voice from within rumbled, "Enter." It was a sound like stones grinding together in the deep earth, a sound that vibrated through the wood and into the bones of my feet. The guard pushed the door open and gestured for me to go inside. He did not look at me. No one did. It was easier to look away from the lamb being led to slaughter. I stepped across the threshold, and the doors closed behind me with a heavy, final thud. The room was a vast cavern of shadows and firelight. A massive hearth dominated one wall, a fire roaring within it, casting dancing light across columns of dark stone that reached up to a vaulted ceiling lost in darkness. Furs, bear, snow leopard, and wolf were thrown over heavy, dark furniture. The scent in the air was overwhelming, a potent and purely masculine mix of pine smoke, leather, old parchment, and something else. Something wild and electric, like the air before a lightning strike. It was the scent of an alpha king, the scent of him. He was not by the fire. He stood before a towering, arched window at the far end of the room, his back to me. He was a silhouette against the blood-red eye of the moon hanging in the ink-black sky. He was immense, larger than any man I had ever seen, his shoulders a bulwark against the night, his presence filling the vast space until it felt hard to breathe. He wore no crown, no royal finery, only simple black breeches and a loose-fitting tunic. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stood frozen just inside the door. My own scent, fear, soap, and the rain-damp wool of my dress, a pathetic whisper in the face of his storm. I waited. I did not know the protocol. Was I to speak, to kneel, to simply stand here until dawn? A silent statue in his lonely hall? The stories never detailed the specifics. They only spoke of the terror, the crushing weight of his aura, the feeling of being hunted in a cage of his making. Finally he spoke, his voice never rising above that low rumble, yet it commanded the very air to be still. They said you were quiet. He did not turn. He continued to stare out at the moon, as if it were an enemy he was assessing. I found my voice, a small, reedy thing I rarely used. I can be, Your Majesty. A low sound, half chuckle, half growl, escaped him. Can be, or always are. He turned then, and the breath caught in my throat. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, a face that was brutally handsome, carved from the northern mountains themselves. His dark hair was long, brushing the collar of his tunic. A jagged scar sliced through his left eyebrow and down his cheek. A pale white line against his weathered skin, but it was his eyes that held me captive. They were the color of a winter storm, a swirling gray that held an ancient, soul-deep weariness, and a terrifying feral light that seemed to burn from within. He was the beast of the stories, the cursed king, and he was more formidable and more broken than I could ever have imagined. He moved away from the window, his stride slow and deliberate, the predatory grace of a wolf stalking its prey. He stopped before a heavy table where a decanter of dark liquid sat beside a single silver goblet. He poured a measure, his hand steady, a stark contrast to my own trembling. They tell me you are Aveline Rain, he said, his storm-gray eyes fixed on me over the rim of the goblet as he took a slow sip. From the fallen rain pack of the southern valleys, a pack known for its healers and its silence. I flinched at the mention of my name, my history. The rain pack was no more, scattered to the winds after refusing to bend the knee to his father a generation ago. We were disgraced, broken. That was why I was here, an Omega servant with no family, no pack, no one to protest my being served up to the lonely king on a moon-cursed night. I was disposable. Yes, Your Majesty, I whispered, my gaze dropping to the floor. Look at me, he commanded. The order was quiet, but it had the force of a physical blow. I forced my head up, my neck aching with the effort. His eyes roamed over me, a clinical, detached assessment that was somehow more unnerving than open lust would have been. He saw the frayed hem of my dress, the fear in my posture, the way my hands were knotted together at my waist. He saw everything. You are afraid, he stated. It was not a question. I swallowed hard. Any woman would be, my king. Because of the stories, he said, a bitter edge to his tone. Because I am the beast that devours the offerings left at his door. He took another step closer, and the primal energy rolling off him intensified. I could feel the power of his wolf, a huge untamed thing straining just beneath the surface of his skin. It was a terrifying, suffocating pressure. They are not entirely untrue. He stopped, now only an arm's length away. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of a beard on his jaw. He smelled of the night itself. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My own wolf, a creature so small and cowed within me that I often forgot she existed, whimpered and tried to crawl into a deeper, darker part of my soul to hide. "Tonight," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming rougher. "The moon is strong. The curse my grandfather made a pact with is stronger. My wolf is not my own." His gaze flickered towards the window, to the bloody lunar glare that poured into the room. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "The loneliness is a cage. The beast rattles its bars. That is why you are here, to be a distraction. A scent of life in a room that reeks of death." My mind reeled. This was not what I expected. Not the cold command of a tyrant, but the raw confession of a prisoner. It made him no less dangerous, but it painted his danger in a new, more tragic light. He raised his hand, the one not holding the goblet, and for a terrifying second, I thought he would strike me. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a feather-light touch against my cheek. My eyes snapped open. His calloused fingertips were tracing the line of my jaw, his touch shockingly gentle. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. It was not fear, it was something else entirely, something foreign and powerful that flared to life in the pit of my stomach. His gaze was no longer detached. It was focused, intense, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than weariness moved in their stormy depths. Confusion. He drew his hand back as if burned, his expression darkening. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary sound of frustrated warning. The air between us crackled, suddenly charged with a tension that had nothing to do with king and servant, and everything to do with the primal forces now stirring in the room. He saw it in my eyes, the shock, the mirrored confusion. The blood moon's light seemed to intensify, flooding the room in a spectral crimson glow. He took a staggering step back, his knuckles white where he gripped his goblet. The untamed wolf within him was fighting for control. I could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the feral glint that was overtaking the man. "Get out," he snarled, the words torn from him. It was a desperate, ragged command. I didn't need to be told twice. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, flooded through me. I turned, my body clumsy with haste, my only thought to flee, to escape the suffocating presence of this man and his monster. My hand was on the cold iron latch of the door when his voice, strained and tortured, stopped me cold. "Wait." I froze, my back to him, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I could hear his heavy breathing, the sound of a man fighting a war within his own skin. The silence stretched again, each second an eternity. I did not dare to turn. Then I felt it. A shift in the air behind me, a wave of heat. His scent, pine and winter and wild musk, enveloped me. He had crossed the room in 2 silent strides. His chest was inches from my back. I could feel the inferno of his body heat, the raw power thrumming through him. "I cannot," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper right beside my ear. "I cannot be alone tonight." Before I could process the terrifying vulnerability in his tone, his hand closed over my arm. His touch was not gentle this time. It was firm, possessive, a brand of heat against the thin wool of my sleeve. He turned me slowly, inexorably, to face him. His eyes were no longer gray. They were molten silver, the pupils blown wide, the feral light completely consuming the man. The curse was upon him. The beast was here. And as the full, bloody light of the moon crowned in the sky, his other hand came up, his fingers tangling in my hair. Tilting my head back, his gaze dropped to my throat, to the pulse hammering there in frantic terror. A low, guttural growl vibrated through his chest and into mine. A sound of hunger, of need, of something breaking free. And in that horrifying, suspended moment, as the Alpha King's curse fully took him, I felt an impossible, traitorous pull toward him. It was a spark igniting deep within me, a sleeping, forgotten magic waking to the call of his own. His thumb brushed over the bare skin of my throat, and the world dissolved into a blinding flash of white-hot light. The white-hot light was not just seen, but felt. It was a searing, instantaneous brand upon my soul, a soundless scream that ripped through the silence of my being. The world fractured into a kaleidoscope of sensation. Terror and a breathtaking, terrifying ecstasy warred within me. My mind, my sense of self, dissolved under the crushing weight of his presence. There was no king, no servant. There was only the beast and the dormant, forgotten creature inside of me rising to meet its call. Time ceased to be linear. It became a blur of primal, overwhelming moments. The scent of him, raw and wild, filled my lungs until I could taste it on my tongue. The scrape of his beard against my skin, the iron grip of his hands, the heat that poured off him in waves. It was an inferno that threatened to consume me. Yet my own body, traitor that it was, leaned into the flame. I was no longer Aveline, the quiet Omega. I was a nerve ending, raw and exposed to a storm I had no name for. His growls were not threats, but a language spoken directly to the wolf I'd kept chained in my heart. And she, to my eternal shame and horror, answered with a silent howl of her own. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the curse. And in the heart of that tempest, a strange, impossible peace settled over me. It was the feeling of a lock finding its key, of a fractured thing being made terrifyingly whole. In the shadow of his beast, I was not afraid, I was found. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over, the storm receded, leaving behind a profound and echoing silence. Darkness claimed me, a welcome abyss after the sensory onslaught. I awoke to the pale, sterile light of dawn. The crimson rage of the blood moon had bled from the sky, leaving behind a wash of gray and soft rose. The fire in the hearth was nothing but a bed of sullen, glowing embers, casting a weak, orange pulse into the chilled air. For a long moment, I didn't move. I lay tangled in a sea of heavy furs on a bed so vast it felt like a ship adrift. My body ached with a deep, thrumming soreness, a language of bruises and stretched muscles that told a story. My mind struggled to piece together. Shame, hot and immediate, washed over me. I was naked beneath the furs, the cool air raising goosebumps on my skin. I pushed myself up, my head swimming. The room was in a state of quiet disarray. The silver goblet lay on its side on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the thick rug. A heavy chair was overturned. It was the scene of a struggle, a storm that had passed through and left its wreckage behind. He was gone. Relief and a sharp, inexplicable pang of loss fought for dominance in my chest. I scrambled from the bed, pulling a massive black bear pelt around my shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him, pine, smoke, and that untamed masculine scent that was now seared into my memory. My own simple dress lay in a heap by the door, a pathetic reminder of the girl who had walked in here last night. As I moved, a strange sensation pulled at the skin on my throat, a persistent, tingling heat, like a fresh sunburn. I walked on unsteady legs toward a large silver-framed looking glass that leaned against one wall. My reflection was a stranger. My ash-blonde hair was a wild tangle. My lips were swollen, and dark, smudged circles stood out beneath my eyes. I looked ravaged, marked, and I was there on the delicate skin of my throat, just above my collarbone, was a brand. It was not a simple bite mark. It was an intricate, swirling pattern of lines that resembled a wolf's eye surrounded by thorns, glowing with a faint silvery light against my pale skin. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic warmth that matched the beating of my own heart. It was impossible. It was a mate mark, the sacred permanent bond that an alpha forms only once, with his fated, and it was burning on my skin. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. My fingers flew to my throat, tracing the raised hot lines. The touch sent another jolt through me, a current of energy that hummed in my blood. It felt alive, and through it, like a phantom echo in the back of my mind, I could feel something else. A low thrum of emotion that wasn't mine. Anger, confusion, and a deep, guttural possessiveness. It was him. I could feel him. The curse. The stories said no woman had ever survived his closeness, let alone the night of the blood moon. They said his wolf was untamed, his soul untouchable. They had been wrong. I had survived. But I had not escaped. I had been branded, claimed by a king who could never have a mate, and by a beast who had just taken one. So it is true. His voice, the low, gravelly rumble from the night before, came from the shadows near the window. I whirled around, clutching the heavy fur tighter around myself. King Roran Vaelric stood there, just as he had when I'd first entered. He was dressed now in fresh black breeches and a dark gray tunic, his long hair tied back at the nape of his neck. The feral light in his eyes was gone, replaced by the storm-gray weariness I had first seen. But it was a different kind of weariness now. It was deeper, more profound, edged with a raw, visceral shock. His gaze was fixed not on my face, but on the glowing mark on my throat. He looked from the brand to my eyes, and I saw the full weight of what had happened crash down upon him. This was not the beast. This was the man, the king, and his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The question was so absurd, so unjust, that it shocked me out of my fear. "What have I done?" The words were a broken whisper. "You summoned me. You were—" "I was not myself," he bit out, taking a step forward. The air crackled with his rage. It was not the hot, wild fury of the beast, but the cold, deadly anger of a king who had lost control. "The curse has rules. It takes. It breaks. It does not bond." He crossed the space between us in 3 long, silent strides. He stopped directly in front of me, forcing me to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. The sheer power emanating from him was just as overwhelming as it had been last night, but now it was laced with a chilling restraint. He was a landslide waiting to happen. He raised his hand, his fingers hovering just an inch from the mark. I could feel the heat from his skin, the pull of the bond urging me to lean into his touch. I flinched back, and a flicker of something, hurt, frustration, crossed his face before the mask of fury slammed back into place. "Do not," he warned, his voice a low growl. "Do not pull away from me." His fingers made contact. He traced the swirling lines of the mark, his touch both a caress and an indictment. The moment his skin met mine, the bond flared. It was a blinding, dizzying rush of his emotions crashing into me. Rage at his loss of control, disbelief at the mark's existence, and a deep, soul-shaking tremor of possessiveness that was so strong it made my knees weak. He felt it too. I saw his eyes widen, his knuckles turn white. He snatched his hand back as if my skin had burned him. He stared at his own hand, then back at me, his expression one of dawning horror. "Impossible," he breathed. He was a prisoner once more, but this time the cage was not his loneliness. It was me. It was this unwanted, undeniable connection. He, the Alpha King who had built his reign on unbreakable control and solitude, was now tethered to a nameless Omega servant. A sharp, authoritative knock sounded at the chamber doors. "Your Majesty, the council awaits your presence." It was the voice of one of his guards. Roran didn't take his eyes off me. The intrusion of the outside world seemed to solidify his resolve, freezing his features into a grim, unreadable mask. "I am delayed," he called out, his voice sharp and absolute. "Allow no one to enter. Post a guard." "Yes, Your Majesty." The footsteps retreated. We were alone again, sealed in the silent aftermath of the storm. He turned his back on me, pacing like a caged wolf before the dying fire. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his shoulders tense with a conflict that was terrifying to behold. I was a problem, a political catastrophe. An Omega servant bearing the Alpha King's mate mark was not just a scandal, it was a weakness his enemies could exploit, a sign that the beast he wrestled with had finally won. "This changes nothing," he said at last, his back still to me. The words were clipped, each one a shard of ice. "You are a servant. You were brought here for a purpose. That purpose is complete." My heart plummeted. He was going to cast me out. Or worse, a girl with a king's mark couldn't be allowed to live, to speak of what had happened. I was a liability, a loose end. "But the mark," I stammered, my hand instinctively covering the brand on my throat. He turned slowly, his face carved from granite. "The mark is a mistake, an aberration of the curse. It will be hidden, and so will you." He walked to a thick tapestry on the far wall, one depicting a great white wolf battling a serpent under a red moon. He pulled it aside, revealing a small, unassuming wooden door. He unlocked it with a heavy iron key he took from his belt. "You will go through here," he commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "There is a suite of rooms. They were my mother's. They have not been used in 20 years. You will remain there. You will speak to no one. You will see no one but the servant I assign to you. You will not leave." It was a prison sentence, a gilded cage. I stared at him, my mind reeling, from the scullery to the king's bed, and now to a forgotten prison. My life had been irrevocably shattered in the course of a single night. "You cannot do this," I whispered, a desperate plea. His eyes, those winter storm eyes, met mine. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the tormented man beneath the ruthless king, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I can," he said, his voice dropping to a low, final whisper that sealed my fate. "I have. You are no longer Aveline Rain, servant of the keep. You are now the kingdom's most dangerous secret, and you are mine to command." The door clicked shut behind me with a sound of chilling finality. The heavy thud of a bolt being thrown echoed the slamming of a cage door. I was left in a pocket of time, a suite of rooms that exhaled the scent of dust, dried herbs, and a profound, lingering sorrow. The air was still and cold, undisturbed for decades. Motes of dust danced like frantic sprites in the single shaft of morning light that pierced the gloom from a tall, grime-covered window. The chamber was opulent in a way that spoke of a bygone era. A large four-poster bed, draped in heavy, faded velvets the color of dried blood, dominated the space. Its wooden frame was intricately carved with images of stags and moons. A dressing table with a tarnished silver mirror stood against one wall, its surface coated in a fine gray powder. A chaise lounge, its silk upholstery cracked and brittle, looked like a pale ghost in the corner. It was a beautiful room, a queen's room, but it was a tomb, a place where life had ended and been forgotten. I stood in the center of the rug, the thick bear pelt still clutched around my shivering body, a savage thing in a place of delicate decay. I was a prisoner, a secret to be locked away. The rage and disbelief from his chambers had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, desolate fear. He hadn't killed me. He had done something worse. He had erased me. My fingers went to my throat, to the source of the persistent, tingling warmth, the mate mark, the mistake. It pulsed against my skin, a silent, living reminder of the bond he denied but could not sever. Through it, I could still feel the faint, distant echo of him, a low thrum of irritation, the sharp focus of a mind engaged in battle. He was in his council meeting, the king playing his part, while the evidence of his monstrous loss of control was locked away in his mother's forgotten chambers. Hours passed. The single beam of sunlight crept across the floor, illuminating the room's slow decay. I did not move. I was a statue of shock, my mind a maelstrom of fractured memories from the night before and the terrifying implications of the dawn. What was to become of me? Would I live out my days in this dusty cage, a specter haunting the royal keep, until I grew old and died, my existence a secret he would take to his grave? The sound of the bolt being drawn back made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. The door creaked open and an older woman stepped inside, carrying a wooden tray. She was tall and thin, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp lines of her face. She wore the simple gray dress of a high-ranking servant, but she carried herself with an air of quiet authority. Her eyes, the color of faded slate, took in the scene, me, wild-haired and wrapped in the king's fur, standing amidst the dust, and showed not a flicker of surprise. She closed the door softly behind her and set the tray down on a small table. It held a pitcher of water, a loaf of bread, cheese, and an apple. A simple, practical meal. "I am Olyena," she said, her voice low and even, a voice accustomed to speaking in hushed corridors. "I am to see to your needs." Her gaze flickered to the mark on my throat, and for the briefest of moments, her composure cracked. I saw a hint of awe, quickly masked, then a deep, somber pity. She knew. Of course she knew what it was. Anyone in a shifter court would. "My needs?" I finally found my voice. It came out as a dry, rasping whisper. "I need to leave." Olyena's expression did not change. "That is not possible," she stated. Not unkindly, but with absolute finality. His Majesty's orders were explicit. "You are to remain here. I am to bring you what you require." She gestured to a pile of folded linens she had carried in. "There is a bathing chamber through that door. The water will be heated. I have brought you fresh clothes." The clothes she had brought were not the coarse brown wool of a servant. They were simple but finely made gowns of soft cotton and dark wool, the kind worn by a lady of the court. The thought of putting them on felt like a betrayal of the girl I had been only yesterday. It was another layer of the gilded cage, dressing me up in the finery of a life that was not mine. I did not move. The fight was a small, useless thing, but it was all I had left. "I will not," Olenna sighed, a quiet, weary sound. "Child," she said, her tone softening slightly, "do not fight the tide. You will only drown. The king, he is not a man to be defied, not now, not after." She trailed off, her gaze again drawn to the mark. "Eat, bathe, for your own good. I will return before dusk to light the fire and the lamps." With that, she gave a short, respectful bow and let herself out, the sound of the bolt sliding home once more sealing my fate. Left alone, the smell of the fresh bread on the tray tormented me. My stomach clenched with a hunger I hadn't realized was there. Defiance was a luxury I could not afford. Slowly, I let the heavy bear pelt fall to the floor. The cold air was a shock against my skin, which was covered in the faint, shadowy bruises of the beast's passion. I felt a flush of shame so intense it was dizzying. The bathing chamber was as forgotten as the rest of the suite, but the large copper tub was already filled with steaming, herb-scented water. The simple act of sinking into the heat was an agonizing relief. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, as if I could wash away the night, the mark, the lingering scent of him that seemed to have permeated my very being. But when I emerged, wrapped in a thick linen towel, and caught my reflection in the steam-fogged mirror, the glowing brand on my throat was still there. Brighter, it seemed, against my clean skin, a permanent stain. I dressed in the simplest of the gowns she had brought, a dark blue wool that felt heavy and foreign. The fabric was soft, a caress against my skin, so different from the rough scratch of my servant's tunic. It made me feel like an imposter, a doll being dressed for a part she never auditioned for. After eating, a restless energy took hold of me. I began to explore my prison. Beyond the bedchamber was a small sitting room, filled with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The books were bound in old leather, their titles written in a script I could barely decipher. I pulled one from the shelf. It was a history of the northern Pax, its pages brittle and smelling of time. Another door led to a small, walled garden, choked with weeds and dead vines, a tangle of thorns where roses might once have grown. A stone bench sat beside a dry, cracked fountain. It was a place of utter neglect. This suite, this garden, it wasn't just unused. It felt cursed, haunted by the memory of the queen who had lived and, I suspected, died here. As the afternoon wore on, the bond, which had been a quiet hum in the background, suddenly flared to life. It was not a gentle pulse. It was a violent, stabbing surge of emotion that buckled my knees. I cried out, clutching my head as a wave of cold, seething rage, not my own, crashed through me. It was his, Roran's. The fury was so potent, so absolute, it felt like it would tear me apart. I could feel the clenching of his jaw, the white-hot desire to draw a blade, the crushing weight of a crown he seemed to despise. It was an unbearable intimacy, a violation of my very thoughts. I was feeling the king's emotions as he sat on his throne or argued with his council. The wave receded as quickly as it had come, leaving me trembling and breathless on the floor. I crawled to the chaise lounge, my body weak, my mind reeling. This was the true nature of the bond. It wasn't just a mark on my skin, it was a bridge between our souls, and his was a tempest that threatened to shatter my own. He had locked me away to hide me from the world, but he could not hide himself from me. Olenna returned as promised at dusk. She moved with quiet efficiency, lighting a fire in the hearth that pushed back the chill and the shadows, and lighting several oil lamps that cast a soft golden glow. She brought another tray, this one with a warm stew and spiced wine. She worked in silence, her presence a quiet reproach to my turmoil. "Who was she?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I was sitting on the edge of the great bed, watching her. Olenna paused in her task of turning down the velvet covers. "Who, my lady?" The honorific was a slap in the face. "I am not a lady." I took a breath, forcing myself to be calm. The queen, his mother, these were her rooms. Olenna's face became a shuttered mask. Queen Iskara was a woman of great beauty and great sadness. What happened to her? "It is not my place to speak of it," she said, her voice firm, but her eyes held a flicker of ancient pain. "The past is a heavy stone, child. Best not to disturb it." She finished her work and moved to the door. Her hand was on the latch when she paused and looked back at me. "He is not a monster," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is a man carrying a monster's burden." Then she was gone, and the bolt slid home, plunging me back into silence. A man carrying a monster's burden, a gilded cage, a bond that felt more like a curse. The contradictions were tearing me apart. The fire crackled in the hearth, a lonely sound in the vast, quiet room. I walked to the tall window and pressed my forehead against the cold, grimy glass. Outside, the light had completely faded, and the first stars were appearing in the indigo sky. I felt utterly, completely alone, and yet I was not. He was a constant, simmering presence at the edge of my senses. A sudden, overwhelming wave of frustration and despair washed over me. It was my own this time. A tear slipped down my cheek. I was a secret, a mistake, a prisoner, but I was also his, a part of him. The injustice of it all, the terrifying intimacy of it, was a knot in my chest. Without thinking, my hand rose to my throat, my fingertips tracing the still warm lines of the mark. It was the only tangible thing in this new reality, a brand of ownership. A whisper escaped my lips, the sound swallowed by the silent room. I spoke his name, not to the king, but to the man whose rage had just torn through me, to the beast who had claimed me. Roran. The name was a breath, a question, a curse. The moment it left my lips, the mark on my throat flared with a sudden, intense heat. It was not a burn, but a brilliant, startling pulse of energy, a jolt that shot through every nerve in my body. Through the bond, I felt an immediate, shocking response from him, a sharp intake of breath, a sudden stillness, a wave of pure, undiluted shock that was as clear as if he stood beside me. He had felt it. He had heard me. My own breath hitched in my throat. My eyes were still fixed on the dark garden outside, but I was no longer seeing it. I was seeing him in my mind's eye, frozen at a desk, his head snapping up, his storm-gray eyes widening in disbelief. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the heavy iron bolt on my door being drawn back with a sharp, violent rasp. My head whipped around. The door swung inward with a force that made it bang against the stone wall. He stood on the threshold, a towering silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. He was no longer in his formal court attire, but in simple black breeches and a loose tunic, his hair unbound. His chest was heaving as if he had run all the way from his chambers. And his eyes, those winter storm eyes, were fixed on me, burning with a furious, wild intensity that was terrifyingly familiar. It was the same look he'd had in the moments before the beast had taken him, a volatile mixture of the man's fury and the wolf's possession. The silence in the room was a living thing, stretched taut between us, vibrating with the force of his presence. He didn't move from the doorway, but the sheer intensity of his stare was a physical pressure, pinning me against the cold glass of the window. The firelight danced across the harsh planes of his face, illuminating the furious conflict in his eyes. It was a war zone in there, and I was somehow the cause. I could feel him through the bond, a roaring inferno of shock, fury, and a terrifying, possessive hunger that resonated deep in my bones. He was fighting it. I could feel the strain of his control, the muscles in his jaw clenching, the knuckles of the hand at his side turning white. He was battling the primal instinct that had dragged him here, the instinct that screamed mate. "How?" he finally bit out, the single word a jagged piece of rock torn from his throat. My own throat was tight with fear. "How? What, Your Majesty?" "Don't," he snarled, taking a single, deliberate step into the room and closing the door behind him. The click of the latch was deafening. "Do not call me that. Not now." He stalked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. "How did you do that? How did you call to me?" I don't know," I stammered, my back pressing hard against the window frame. There was nowhere to run. "I just said your name." He stopped a foot away, close enough that I was once again engulfed in his scent. That heady mix of pine and winter air that was now inextricably linked to my terror. And a strange, traitorous sense of belonging. "No one has ever reached me like that," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Not through thought, not through a whisper across the keep." His eyes narrowed, searching my face for some sign of deception, some hidden power I might be concealing. "What are you?" The question hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. I was nothing, An omega, a servant, a girl from a broken pack. I am what you see, I whispered, my voice trembling. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him. What I see, he mused, his gaze dropping to the glowing mark on my throat, is an impossibility, a curse that has twisted into something new, a bond that should not exist. He reached out not to touch me, but to point a single accusatory finger at the mark. This thing, it connects us. I felt your fear when Oleana left. I felt your despair by the window, and I felt your call. The admission stunned me. He could feel me, just as I could feel him. This bridge between us was a two-way street. The thought was both horrifying and strangely comforting. I was not alone in this violation. We were trapped together. My fear, still present, was joined by a spark of defiance. He had imprisoned me, erased me, and now he was blaming me for the consequences of a bond he had forged. You made this, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I touched the mark myself, the gesture both protective and defiant. This was your wolf, your curse, not mine. His expression hardened, the scar on his brow standing out pale against his darkening skin. My curse has never done this, he growled. For a century, the Velvet Kings have carried this burden. On the blood moon, the beast walks. It is a thing of pure, mindless instinct. It hungers, it breaks, it does not choose, it does not bind. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, with a piercing intensity that seemed to strip away every layer of my being. But it chose you. The words hung between us. It chose you, not the king, not the man, but the beast. The mindless, instinctual creature at the core of his being had seen something in me, the quiet omega, and had claimed me. The thought was so staggering, so incomprehensible, that it left me breathless. He must have seen the shock and confusion on my face, because a fraction of the anger in his own expression eased, replaced by a deep, weary frustration. He turned away from me, pacing the length of the room like the caged wolf he was. My mother, he said, his voice rough with an old, unhealed pain. He gestured vaguely to the opulent, decaying room. Queen Iskara, she was a gentle soul, a healer from a southern pack, much like yours. My father brought her here, convinced his love could tame the Veilric curse. He believed that with a true mate, the beast would be soothed. He stopped and stared into the fire, his profile etched in golden shadow. He was wrong. The beast does not recognize love. It does not recognize vows or titles. It only recognizes power and weakness. It saw her gentleness as a vulnerability. It broke her. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of his unspoken words. Oleana's words came back to me. A woman of great beauty and great sadness. She hadn't died here. She had been shattered. After her, Roran continued, his voice dropping lower, my father declared the Veilric line would never again take a true mate. We would rule alone. We would endure the curse alone. Companions for the night, yes. Distractions, disposables. But never a bond, never a queen. To do so would be to sentence another woman to my mother's fate. He finally turned back to me, his eyes filled with a torment so profound it stole my breath. I swore an oath on my father's grave that I would uphold his law, that I would never, ever bind myself to another. And then you, he said, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his own self-loathing, walked into my chambers, and in one night, I have broken the most sacred vow I ever made. I have put you in the exact same danger. The truth of his words settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about hiding a political scandal. This was about him trying to protect me. His method was cruel, a cage, silence, isolation, but the motive was a twisted, desperate form of mercy. He had locked me away not just from the world, but from himself, from the beast he was convinced would destroy me. But it didn't, I whispered, the realization dawning on me. It didn't break me, it marked me. He stared at me, a maelstrom of emotions swirling in his gray eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny it, but no words came out. We were standing in the wreckage of his certainty, in a reality that defied every law his world was built upon. The tension in the room shifted. The anger and fear were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but something new was rising to take its place. A reluctant, magnetic pull. The bond, now that we had both acknowledged its power, seemed to hum in the air between us. It was a living current, drawing us closer despite our wills. He took a step toward me, then another. I did not retreat. My heart was hammering, a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. He stopped before me, so close I could feel the heat of his body, see the flicker of the firelight reflected in the dark pools of his pupils. "Why?" he asked, the word a raw whisper of pure confusion. "Why you?" He raised his hand, his movements slow, hesitant. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, tentative, as if he were touching a flame he expected to burn him. A jolt of pure energy shot through me, and I saw his eyes widen as he felt it too. The bond flared, a wave of warmth and connection that was so powerful it made me dizzy. It wasn't just his anger and torment I felt now. Beneath it, buried deep, was a well of loneliness so vast and so profound it was a physical ache in my own chest. I felt decades of solitude, of fighting a war within himself, of being a king on a throne of ice. And for the first time, in that single touch, I felt a flicker of hope from him, a terrifying, fragile hope that he immediately tried to crush. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, and a soft, involuntary gasp escaped me. His gaze dropped to my mouth, his expression darkening with an internal battle that was plain to see. The man, the king, was screaming at him to pull back, to maintain his distance, to protect me from himself. But the wolf, the primal being that had chosen me, was pushing him forward, demanding he claim what was his. His head lowered, his other hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The gesture was possessive, yet unbearably gentle. I knew I should pull away. I should be terrified. I was. But my body was betraying me, leaning into his touch, my own dormant wolf recognizing its mate, its alpha. "This is madness," he murmured, his breath ghosting across my lips. His eyes were closed now, his forehead resting against mine. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by a raw, aching need. "I know," I breathed. The world narrowed to the space between our mouths. I could feel the tremor in his hand, the ragged edge of his breath. He was going to kiss me. The thought sent a thrill of fear and anticipation through me. This was wrong, dangerous, impossible, and I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. But just as his lips were about to touch mine, a violent shudder racked his entire body. His eyes snapped open, no longer a mixture of storm gray and silver, but blazing with a pure feral light. He shoved me away from him with a guttural snarl, a sound of self-revulsion and terror. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall with a hard thud. He staggered back, clutching his head, his face contorted in agony. "No," he choked out, his voice a strangled gasp. It wants. The beast was rising, here, now, stirred by the proximity, by the touch, by the undeniable truth of the bond. He had come here to confront me, but in doing so, he had brought the monster to my door. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic, a silent, desperate plea. He was losing control. The king was being submerged by the primal tide of the wolf, and the last vestiges of the man were screaming a warning. "Get away from me," he roared, the command a broken, desperate plea. He turned and stumbled toward the door, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. He fumbled with the latch, his powerful body shaking with the force of the internal war. He ripped the door open and fled into the corridor, slamming it shut behind him. I was left trembling against the wall, my heart pounding, my lips tingling from a kiss that never happened. The room was empty again, but his scent, his rage, his despair, and his terrifying hunger lingered like a ghost. He hadn't just run from me. He had run from himself, from the truth of what we were. And in the echoing silence of my gilded cage, I finally understood. He wasn't my jailer. We were fellow prisoners, locked in a cage built for two. The days that followed bled into a monotonous, suffocating gray. I existed in the suspended time of Queen Iskara's chambers, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was no longer my own. Olyena came and went like a silent tide, bringing meals, fresh linens, and books from the royal library. Her face remained a mask of polite servitude, but her eyes, those knowing, slate-gray eyes, held a deep and constant pity. We rarely spoke, There was nothing to say. My questions were too dangerous, and her answers were not hers to give. I learned to live with the bond, with the constant low-level hum of Roran's presence at the edge of my consciousness. It was a phantom limb, an ache for something I'd never truly had. I felt the ebb and flow of his days, the ironclad control he exerted during his council meetings, the restless, prowling energy that consumed him in the afternoons, and the deep, soul-crushing weariness that settled over him in the dead of night. He never slept well. I knew this because his turbulent, nightmare-plagued rest was a constant disturbance to my own. I would wake in the dark, my heart pounding, drenched in the echoes of his fear, the phantom sensation of claws and blood, and a loneliness so cold it burned. He did not return, but he was always there. He fought the bond with a relentless, brutal will. I could feel him actively pushing me away, building walls of ice and iron in his mind to sever the connection. The effort was a palpable strain, a constant pressure that gave me headaches and left me perpetually exhausted. Yet the bond held. It was a living thing, forged in the primal fire of the blood moon, and it was stronger than his will, stronger than his pride, stronger than his fear. I spent my time in the neglected garden, pulling weeds with my bare hands until my fingers were raw, simply for something to do. I found a single stubborn rosebush that had survived the choking thorns and coaxed it back to life. I read the ancient histories in the library, losing myself in tales of forgotten kings and shifter wars. I learned about the Vaelric line, a dynasty built on conquest and shadowed by the curse that had come from a pact with a wild god of the mountains. They were a line of kings who ruled with the beast chained inside them. One afternoon, a week after he had fled my rooms, the bond flared with a violence that knocked the air from my lungs. It was not anger this time, or frustration. It was pain, a pure, blinding agony that was not mine. I cried out, collapsing against the stone bench in the garden, my vision spotting with black. The pain was sharp, searing, located in his left shoulder. I could feel the tearing of flesh, the hot, wet gush of blood. He was injured. Badly, panic, cold, and absolute seized me. My wolf, the quiet, submissive thing I'd suppressed for years, rose up with a desperate, protective snarl. Mate is hurt. Mate is in danger. The instinct was so powerful, so overwhelming, it shocked me. I stumbled back inside, pacing the confines of my chamber like a caged animal. The agony through the bond subsided into a deep, throbbing ache, but the fear remained. A frantic, clawing thing in my chest. What happened? Was he attacked? An accident? I felt his consciousness swim in and out of focus, clouded by pain and whatever drafts the royal physicians were forcing on him. Through the haze, I felt other emotions, not his, but those around him. The sharp anxiety of his guards, the clinical concern of a healer, and another, a cold, sharp spike of something that felt disturbingly like satisfaction. It was a fleeting, venomous thought from someone near him, quickly masked, but I felt it as clearly as I felt the pain in his shoulder. Someone was glad he was hurt. The realization chilled me to the bone. He had enemies not just outside his walls, but within them. For 2 days, I was tormented by the echoes of his recovery. I felt the healer setting the bone, the sharp sting of stitches closing a deep gash, the fever that followed. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I could only pace my cage and feel his distant suffering, utterly helpless. Olenna noticed my distress, her gaze lingering on my pale face and the dark circles under my eyes, but she said nothing. She simply left a calming herbal tea on my tray, a small, unspoken gesture of kindness. On the 3rd day, the pain through the bond had dulled to a persistent, heavy ache. I felt him awake, his mind clearer than it had been, and with that clarity came a wave of grim, cold fury. He knew the hunting accident had been no accident at all. That evening, I was huddled on the chaise lounge, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the fire. When I heard the sound I had been dreading and longing for in equal measure, the bolt on my door slid back. Roran stood there, his left arm in a sling of black silk, his face pale and drawn. He looked tired, but the weariness was overshadowed by a dangerous, predatory light in his eyes. He had come straight from his sickbed, still dressed in a loose black shirt and breeches. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, as if gathering his strength. "You felt it," he stated. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I couldn't tear my eyes from the sling, from the visible proof of the pain that had ripped through me. He pushed himself off the door and walked slowly toward the fire, moving with a stiff, careful grace. He lowered himself into the large armchair opposite the chaise, the movement costing him a sharp intake of breath. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. "An arrow meant for a stag," they said. He rasped, his voice raw. "A misfire from a new guard during the royal hunt." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were chips of ice. "The guard is dead. He took his own life in his cell last night. Convenient." The cold satisfaction I had sensed. It all clicked into place. "It was a betrayal," I whispered. He gave a slight, grim nod. "There are those on my council who believe the Velric line has grown weak, that my affliction makes me unfit to rule. They see my solitude not as strength, but as a vulnerability. They would see another on the throne, one of their own choosing." He looked down at his injured arm. This was a test, to see if the beast would emerge to protect the man, to see how deeply the curse truly runs. "And did it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It was close," he admitted, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "The pain, it almost broke the leash, but I held on. The king cannot be seen to be a mindless animal. That is the ultimate weakness they are waiting for." We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. He had come here, to his prisoner, to his secret, to confess a weakness he would show no one else. The intimacy of the moment was staggering. The bond between us was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary, the only place he could lower his shield. "When you were hurt," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I felt something, my wolf. She wanted to protect you." I looked down at my hands, ashamed of the admission, of the primal, possessive instinct that had risen so fiercely within me. He looked at me, and for the first time, the icy fury in his eyes softened, replaced by a profound, searching curiosity. "Your wolf," he repeated softly. "The rain pack was broken before you were born. You were raised in the keep, an omega among servants. You have never shifted, have you?" "No," I admitted. "I was always told I was wolfless, a disgrace. My wolf is small, quiet. I keep her hidden." "And yet she answered mine," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "She answered the beast." He leaned forward, his good hand resting on his knee, his gaze intense. "Aveline, the night of the blood moon, when my wolf claimed you, what did you feel?" The question was direct, clinical, the question of a commander studying a battlefield. But beneath it, I felt his own desperate need to understand. I thought back to that chaotic, terrifying blur of sensation. "I was afraid," I said honestly, but underneath the fear, there was something else, not pain, not submission. I struggled for the words. It felt like recognition, like a piece of my soul that had been dormant my whole life suddenly woke up. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, but a new light was dawning in his eyes. He was seeing beyond the Omega servant, beyond the political problem. He was seeing the other half of the impossibility that bound them. Without a word, he rose from his chair and came to sit on the edge of the chaise lounge beside me. The space between us was electric. He smelled of herbs from the healer's poultice, and beneath that the familiar scent of pine and winter. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly, carefully, reached out his good hand and placed it over mine. The contact was a lightning strike. The bond flared, not with pain or anger, but with a wave of pure, unadulterated connection. His loneliness washed over me, his fear, his crushing burden, and my own feelings, my fear, my confusion, my impossible, growing affection, flowed back to him. I saw his eyes widen as he felt the truth of it, the depth of the echo he found in me. "All my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the beast has been my enemy, a mindless rage to be contained, a monster to be chained." His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a gesture of profound, aching tenderness. "But with you, it was different. It wasn't mindless, it was deliberate. It chose." His gaze dropped to the mark on my throat, which was pulsing with a soft, silvery light in the fire's glow. This isn't a brand of ownership, is it? He whispered, a look of dawning revelation on his face. It's a seal, a key. It locked my beast to you, and in doing so, it woke yours. He looked back into my eyes, and the king, the warrior, the cursed man, was gone. In his place was just Roran, a soul who had been fighting a war alone for his entire life and had just found an unexpected, impossible ally. You are not my weakness, Aveline, he breathed, his voice filled with a terrible, wondrous awe. You are my anchor. He leaned in, his resolve finally broken, his need overriding his fear. He cupped my face with his hand, his thumb stroking my cheek. The loneliness in his eyes was replaced by a raw, desperate yearning that mirrored my own. And this time, there was no hesitation. This time, there was no beast to fight. There was only the man, the woman, and the undeniable truth of the bond between them. His lips met mine. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation and discovery, of loneliness and belonging. It was the taste of spiced wine, of unspoken confessions, of 1,000 nights spent in solitude. It was a breaking of oaths and the forging of a new, terrifying reality. My hands came up to clutch his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted on its axis. He groaned, a sound of profound relief and surrender, and deepened the kiss, his good arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me against him until there was no space left between us, only the searing heat of the bond, finally irrevocably acknowledged. The ancient dusty room, my gilded cage, faded away. There was only him. There was only us. And in that moment, the monster's burden became a shared secret, a shared strength. But as his lips moved from mine to the sensitive skin of my throat, tracing a path of fire toward the glowing mark, I felt a new, chilling premonition. The betrayal he had survived was only the beginning. His enemies had been testing a weakness, but they had no idea they had just revealed his greatest strength, and they would do anything to destroy it. The kiss shattered the last of my reservations, dissolving the bars of my gilded cage into mist. It was a claiming, not of a king to a subject, but of a soul to its counterpart. When he finally pulled away, we were both breathless, the air in the room thick with unspoken promises and a terrifying, exhilarating new reality. His forehead rested against mine, his storm-gray eyes searching my face, filled with a raw vulnerability I never thought I would see in a man like him. Aveline, he breathed, my name a prayer on his lips. The bond between us was a torrent now, a roaring river of shared emotion. I could feel his relief. So profound it was a physical release, and beneath it a burgeoning hope that was as fragile as a newborn bird. But there was fear too, a deep, cold dread for what he had just unleashed. They will come for you, he said, his voice grim. He pulled back, the warmth of his body leaving me chilled. The king was returning, the strategist assessing the new, infinitely more dangerous battlefield. My enemies, the ones on my council, they suspected I had a weakness. Now, he looked at me, at the mark on my throat, at the way I looked at him. Now they will know I have something to protect. That makes me more dangerous to them, and you, the most valuable target in the kingdom. He began to pace again, his movements agitated despite the ache in his shoulder. Vareth, he muttered. The name spat like a curse. My cousin, he has been circling the throne like a vulture for years. He leads the faction that believes my curse has tainted the bloodline. He speaks of honor and the old ways, but all he craves is the crown. I remembered the cold spike of satisfaction I'd felt through the bond when he was injured. It had to be Vareth. He was there, wasn't he, when you were hurt? Roran stopped, his eyes narrowing. He was the first to offer his condolences. His scent was thick with false sympathy. He ran his good hand through his hair, a gesture of deep frustration. I cannot prove it. He is clever. He moves his pieces through others. The guard who misfired was one of his men. But to accuse the High Lord of the Council without proof is to invite civil war. The fragile peace of our moment was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of politics and betrayal. I was no longer just a secret. I was the fulcrum on which the fate of the kingdom now rested, a pawn, but a pawn that could topple a king. What will you do? I asked, my voice small. He came to a halt in front of me, his expression hardening with resolve. I will do what I should have done from the beginning. I will not hide you. I will arm you. He took my hands in his grip firm and steady. The Rain Pack was known for more than their silence, Aveline. They were wardens of the old magic. Healers, yes, but also seers, empaths. Their blood runs true with the earth. Your wolf is not small or weak. She is simply dormant. The bond has woken her. Now you must learn to command her. The idea was terrifying. To embrace the very part of myself I had been taught to despise my entire life? I don't know how. I will teach you, Aunt, he said, his voice a low, resolute vow. The beast in me recognizes the power in you. It's why it chose you. It saw what the man could not. We are two halves of the same curse, the same blessing, my raw, untamed power, and your control, your anchor. He squeezed my hands. We will train, here, in secret. In this garden, in these rooms. You will learn to feel the world not just with your senses, but with your soul, and I will learn to trust the bond instead of fighting it. And so began our strange tutelage. My gilded cage became a training ground. Every night, after the keep had fallen into slumber, Roran would come to my chambers. The hours were filled not with passion, but with a fierce, focused intensity. He pushed me, challenged me, forced me to look inward to the creature I had kept chained for so long. He started with the senses. Close your eyes, he would command, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of the walled garden. What do you hear? At first all I heard was the wind, the rustle of the leaves on my sad little rose bush. No, he'd insist, his presence a warm, solid weight behind me. Listen deeper. Listen with your blood. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to learn. I heard the frantic heartbeat of a mouse in the walls. I heard the slow, deep breathing of the sleeping guards down the corridor. I heard the sap moving in the ancient ivy that clung to the stone. The world, which had always been muted, exploded into a symphony of hidden life. He taught me about scent. He would bring me herbs from the royal greenhouse, wolfsbane, silvervine, moon petal, and make me identify them by scent alone, first with my nose, and then with the deeper sense that came from the wolf. I began to smell not just the plant but its life force, its properties, its connection to the earth. I could smell the faintest trace of rain on the wind hours before a storm, the lingering scent of fear in a room where an argument had taken place. And through it all, the bond deepened. We no longer needed words. I could feel his frustration when I struggled, his flicker of pride when I succeeded. He learned to lean on my presence, to draw a measure of calm from my own steadying emotions when the beast grew restless within him. During the day, I would feel a sudden wave of his anger from the council chambers, and I would focus, sending a wave of quiet, cool tranquility back across the connection. I would feel the tension in his shoulders ease, miles away, and I knew he felt me. I was his anchor, and he was my teacher. One night, a fortnight into our training, he brought 2 silver goblets and a decanter of dark wine into the sitting room. There was a different energy about him, a quiet solemnity. Tonight is different, he said, handing me a goblet. Tonight, we do not train your senses. We test your strength. I took a sip of the wine, its warmth spreading through my chest. What do you mean? The bond, he said, sitting opposite me, his injured arm now free of its sling, but still held carefully at his side. It is more than a bridge for emotion. It is a conduit for power. My strength is primal, raw, destructive. Yours is something else, something older. You have the ability to soothe, to heal. I want to try something. He held out his hand. Give me your hand. I placed my hand in his. His skin was warm, calloused. Now, he said, his voice low and intense, reach for me, not with your mind but with your wolf. Feel the beast inside of me. Do not fear it, touch it. I closed my eyes, terrified. I had spent my life hiding from my own wolf, and he was asking me to seek out his monster. I took a deep breath and did as he asked. I looked inward, past the silence and the fear, and found the small, trembling spark of my own wolf. I urged her forward, toward the bond, toward the raging inferno that was Roran. The moment she touched the edge of his power, it was like putting my hand into a blast furnace. The sheer, untamed violence of his cursed wolf was overwhelming. It was a maelstrom of rage, pain, and a century of caged fury. My own wolf whimpered, wanting to flee. Stay. Roran's voice echoed in my mind, not through my ears, but through the bond itself. Do not fight it, soothe it. I didn't know how. It was like trying to calm a hurricane with a whisper. Then I remembered the rose bush in the garden, how I had coaxed it back to life not with force, but with patience, with a gentle tending. I focused on that feeling. I did not try to cage his beast. I simply offered it peace. I poured every ounce of my own quiet nature, my empathy, my desperate love for the man who housed this monster, into the bond. I imagined wrapping the raging fire in cool, soft moss, not to extinguish it, but to give it a place to rest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The beast raged against my presence. Then slowly, miraculously, I felt a shift, a subtle easing of the storm. The roars of fury quieted to a low, guttural growl. The frantic, clawing energy settled into a deep, watchful stillness. I felt the great beast lay its head down, its massive shoulders slumping, not in defeat, but in a moment of profound, exhausted truce. I opened my eyes. Roran was staring at our joined hands, his face a mask of utter disbelief. A single tear traced a path down his scarred cheek. No one, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, has ever been able to do that. Not healers, not mystics, not even my own father. They tried to chain it. You gave it comfort. He looked up at me, his storm-gray eyes shining with a reverence that made my heart ache. In that moment, we were not king and servant, not Alpha and Omega. We were two broken halves of a whole who had finally found the secret to mending each other. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss of profound gratitude and breathtaking tenderness. But as our lips met, a sudden, violent jolt ripped through the bond. It was a spike of pure, unadulterated terror, and it was not his or mine. It was Olyena's. We broke apart, our heads snapping toward the door. I could feel her, somewhere in the keep, her heart hammering with fear, her scent flooding with panic. And I could feel something else, the cold, reptilian presence of Lord Werewolf. He knows. Roran's thought crashed into mine, sharp and deadly. He found her. He knows about you. The sound of a heavy body slumping to the floor echoed faintly from the corridor, followed by the scrape of armored boots. Not the steady tread of the royal guard, but the furtive, hurried steps of men who did not belong there. Roran was on his feet in an instant, his face transforming into a mask of cold, lethal fury. The truce with the beast was over. It rose within him, not as an enemy, but as an ally, a controlled weapon he now wielded. His eyes began to glow with that familiar, silvery light. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice a low, predatory sound that was no longer entirely human. He drew a wicked-looking dagger from a sheath at his belt. The bolt on my door wasn't drawn back. It was sheared off with a screech of tortured metal. The heavy door flew inward, torn from its hinges. 3 men stood in the doorway, clad in the dark leather of the council guard, their swords drawn. And behind them, a cruel smirk on his handsome face, stood Lord Werewolf. He was tall, with the same dark Valeric hair as Roran, but his eyes were a cold, flat black. His gaze swept the room, taking in the 2 goblets of wine, the rumpled chaise lounge, and me standing behind the king, his eyes fixed on the glowing mate mark on my throat, and his smirk widened into a triumphant sneer. "Well, well, cousin," Werewolf said, his voice a silky, poisonous drawl. "It seems the rumors are true. The beast has finally found a pet." He looked directly at me, his black eyes filled with contempt. To think the great Valeric line brought to its knees by a nameless Omega bitch. My only regret is that I'll have to kill you before I get to see what sort of mongrel pups you might have produced. The northern wind carried the scent of pine and the clean, cold promise of the coming snow. It whipped the heavy ceremonial furs around my shoulders as I stood on the great stone balcony of the keep, overlooking the thousands of shifters gathered in the courtyard below. A sea of upturned faces, a mixture of hope, awe, and lingering uncertainty watched me. To my right, Roran stood, not as a king hiding his curse, but as an alpha beside his mate. His left hand rested on the small of my back, a warm, steadying presence. The silver mate mark on my throat, once a symbol of shame and secrecy, was now proudly displayed above the high collar of my deep blue gown, a silent, glowing testament to the truth. It had been 6 months since the night Werewolf had tried to shatter our world, 6 months of upheaval, of blood, and of rebirth. The fight in my chambers had been brutal and swift. Roran, channeling the controlled fury of the beast, had been a whirlwind of death. Vareth's men were skilled, but they were not prepared for an alpha king fighting not for a crown, but for his mate. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was inhuman, his dagger a blur of silver, his growls the sound of the grave. But my part in the battle was not what anyone expected. As Vareth, his face a mask of fury at his men's failure, lunged for me, a blade in his hand, something inside me broke free. It was not a choice. It was an instinct. My small, quiet wolf, the one I had soothed Roran's beast with, rose up not in a rage, but in a wave of pure, concentrated power. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I simply met his eyes and pushed. I pushed with all the empathetic force I possessed, all the pain and fear he had caused, all the protective fury for my mate. It wasn't a physical blow, but a psychic one. Vareth stumbled back, crying out, his hand flying to his head as if he'd been struck by a hammer. He saw, in that instant, a flash of his own death, the utter desolation of his ambition, the cold emptiness of his soul. It was a truth so profound it broke his nerve, in that moment of hesitation. Roran was upon him. The trial was a formality. Olyena, bruised but alive, had been found locked in a closet. Her testimony, combined with the confession of a captured guard, was enough to condemn Vareth. He was stripped of his titles and exiled to the frozen wastes, a fate worse than death. His co-conspirators on the council were exposed, their web of deceit torn apart. Roran, with me at his side, had purged the rot from his court. The aftermath was a political firestorm. The secret was out. The king had a mate, an Omega servant, unmarked by any pack, who bore the brand of his cursed wolf. Scandalous whispers turned to open debate. Was this a sign of the apocalypse, or a blessing in disguise? Roran's answer was to shatter a century of tradition. He did not hide me. He presented me. We walked the halls together, our bond a visible, palpable thing. We trained in the open, in the royal training grounds. He taught me the sword, and I taught him the quiet strength of his own heart. I learned to not just soothe the beast, but to borrow its senses, to see with its eyes, to feel the pulse of the land around us. The wolfless Omega discovered that her power was not in the shift, but in the soul. I was the whisper that could calm the storm, the anchor that could hold the tide. I found my voice, not just in speech, but in counsel. The lords who had first looked at me with scorn soon learned that my quiet observations could cut to the heart of a matter with more precision than any pompous debate. I saw the hidden fears, the secret ambitions, the threads of loyalty and betrayal that wove through the court. I was not a queen of conquest. I was a queen of connection. Now, on the day of the first snow, Roran had called the gathering of the packs. He stood before them all and told them the truth. He spoke of the Veilric curse, not as a source of shame, but as a burden his line had carried. He spoke of his mother's tragic fate, of the vow he had made, and of the vow he had broken. Then he turned to me. He took my hand, his grip warm and firm, and held it up for all to see. For a century, his voice boomed across the courtyard, amplified by the power of his alpha command. We believed the beast was a monster to be chained. We were wrong. It was a guardian waiting for its other half. It was a lock waiting for its key. His storm-gray eyes, now clear of the old torment, found mine, and the love in them was so powerful it was a physical force. This mark, he said, his thumb brushing my throat, sending a familiar, warm jolt through me, is not a brand of a curse. It is the seal of a new covenant. Avalyn Rain is not my weakness. She is the North's greatest strength. She is the anchor to the beast, the heart of the king, and from this day forward, she is your queen. A shocked silence fell over the massive crowd. A queen who was an unmarked Omega. A queen who had not been chosen by treaty or alliance, but by the king's cursed wolf. It defied every law and tradition. Then from the front ranks, an old alpha from a mountain pack, his face as weathered as the rock he lived on, dropped to one knee. "The wild god chose her, Knaisa," he roared, his voice rough with age and conviction. "We follow the wild god." Slowly, like a ripple spreading through a vast lake, one by one, then dozen by dozen, then hundred by hundred, the shifters of the northern packs knelt. They knelt to the king who had shown them his soul, and to the quiet Omega who had tamed it. Tears streamed down my face, freezing in the cold air. I looked at Roran and he smiled. A true, unguarded smile that reached his eyes and transformed his harsh face into something breathtakingly beautiful. He leaned down and kissed me, a soft, reverent kiss in front of all our people, sealing his proclamation. The bond between us hummed with a deep, resonant peace. I could feel his love, his pride, his unwavering certainty, and he could feel mine, a love born in terror and shame, reforged in secret lessons and shared burdens, and now shining as brightly as the winter sun. We were not a fairy tale, we were a legend, carved from a curse. He was the winter storm, and I was the eye of it. He was the beast of the blood moon, and I was the dawn that followed. Together, we were a king and queen unlike any the North had ever seen. The loneliness was gone, the cage was broken, and as our people rose to their feet, with a roar of allegiance that shook the very foundations of the mountains, I knew we were finally, truly home. The story of the Marked King had ended, and the reign of the Marked Queen had just begun.